I'm Penny Imison. I'm the director for Rocktown History, and it's always a pleasure to bring people together to talk about history, and especially local history. I'm particularly excited to announce that we are now kicking off formally civic season, which will last here at Rocktown History until July the 5th. So for the month of June, we have had pay-as-you-can admission. So we don't want to have any barriers to entry for people to come into the galleries to see the featured exhibit you'll hear more about tonight and the rest of the history that is on display. We are having a Fourth Friday series, and that will start during civic season on June the 27th. And we will have some music, some activities. The genealogy library will be open, so that's 5 to 7, again, to bring more people in at times when the museum is not open. So I'm thanking F&M Bank for their sponsorship of Civic Season and the Fourth Friday programs. Anything else? Oh, yes, there is so much more. We have so much going on these days. I hope everybody will look at rocktownhistory.org for upcoming events. Between the book club, the coffee mills, the Third Thursday talks, the Fourth Fridays, there's something for everybody, and I hope that everyone will come next. Our next coffee mill is this coming Tuesday, and Jay Folk will be talking about store tokens, and I hope I got that name right. So that will be a fun talk. And then in July the 8th, we'll have classic car show and tell. So hopefully we'll have better weather that day. And our next Third Thursday talk is Sarah Bixler talking about the restoration at the Lincoln Homestead and the history of that property here in Rockingham County. So everyone's here tonight for our program on the Resilience Amid Resistance exhibition and project. And I'm going to introduce Beau Dickenson, and he will introduce the students. We'll introduce the topic, and then we will invite the students to speak as well. I'm not going to go through your long list, but Beau is the social studies coordinator for the Rockingham County Public Schools. He's the co-creator of the field trip program that has culminated in this exhibition this year. He has been a Rocktown History trustee. He's a mentor and a great partner. And I'm just so happy to invite you back.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much. It is indeed an honor to be here. Hello to everyone who's here, as well as everybody that's joining us online. It is certainly our honor to feature a student-led project. And in 20 years of teaching in the classroom, I would have to say that this particular year, this particular project is the one that stands out the most. So there's a number of stories. So I've tried my best to try to weave all of those in and give them justice and set up what the students are going to give as their experience and some commentary and reflection on that day, May 17th, when this marker was dedicated in the morning and a companion museum exhibit was installed and unveiled here in the afternoon. So May 17th was a busy day. That was like planning 2 weddings personally for me, but I felt like both of those went off without a hitch, and it was a very successful day. We had wonderful weather, as you can see in the photograph, and then here at the museum afterwards was just a really special event. Both of them being student-led, both of them rooted in student civic action, which is why I teach social studies and why that's important to me as an educator. So let me give a little background on this photograph, though. This Resilience Amid Resistance was titled as such by the 2 young ladies there in black that are on, bookended by myself there on the far right, standing next to Elizabeth Kidd from Spotswood High School. And on the far left is my co-creator and partner in this endeavor, Mr. Owen Longacre, who's a teacher at Spotswood High School, a history teacher, nationally board certified himself, standing next to Priya Dua, who is also a Spotswood High School student. And this was their project. That evolved out of originally a Rocktown History exhibit and project and grant-funded endeavor known as the Knocking Down Walls documentary. But I notice I did skip through the fact that this is tied to Juneteenth, which is today, June 19th. As many of you know, June 19th, 1865 is the holiday that we recognize and celebrate the end of enslavement and the emancipation of over 4 million people in the United States, and in that moment of freedom after the Civil War. What's important to note about that, of course, is that it's tied to our project, I think, very thematically. That is the long journey and struggle toward freedom that began then and prior to, of course, leading up to the Civil War and continued on and really in spirit to this day, just in different struggles and in different contexts, of course. But the photograph on the left is the first public reading of the Emancipation Proclamation that was in Virginia, out towards Fort Monroe, out there on the peninsula, towards, I think, at Hampton, because that's the oak that still stands, the famous Emancipation Oak, named as such because this happened there. This is the first public reading declaring the emancipation and freedom of formerly enslaved people in Confederate-held territory. Juneteenth is June 19th, 1865, of course, though. So I think the importance of this holiday is recognizing that the law is only what is enforced. So it took the presence of Union soldiers in Galveston, Texas, well after the Civil War was over, because, of course, that ended in April of 1865. This is June 19th, well after the surrender at Appomattox, that the presence of Union forces finally freed all of the remaining enslaved peoples. I draw a parallel to that to the photograph that's on the right in 1954. Of course, that is Thurgood Marshall and other members of the NAACP legal defense team who argued Brown versus Board of Education. That is May 17th, 1954. And that declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional, as we all know. That in itself would also be a journey to see that decision be implemented and that interpretation of the law be carried forward into communities, into schools, and places throughout this country. And that was a very long struggle. And I think harkens back to the similar challenges faced by emancipation, that the law is only the law if it's enforced and carried forward. So we're going to tell a little bit of that story tonight, and we'll touch on that, of course, here at the federal courthouse in Harrisonburg, where Judge John Paul Jr. of Audubon issued the first ruling to call forth the implementation of Brown in the Commonwealth of Virginia 2 years after the Supreme Court had ruled such in 1954. But there's a story behind that, of course, as I mentioned before. This started 2 years before, so that was May 17th of this year, this past May. And in May of 2023, the same two students plus three others, Miriam Laux, Nicole Siptak, and Cherith Bradshaw, plus Priya and Elizabeth, 5 students from Spotswood High School, researched and spent probably the better part of a school year developing a film to tell that story. And they titled that film the Knocking Down Walls documentary. In February of 2024, they were recognized and named the Barbara Johns Student Youth Change Agent Award winners. And that was the inaugural year of that award. They were given that in Farmville, Virginia, very symbolically. The photograph that you see there is in Jarman Auditorium at Longwood University. There they are receiving the award on the far right, and here on the far left, they are with Joan Johns Cobbs, who is the sister of the late Barbara Johns. She herself is also a Brown v. Board plaintiff, as well as a Moton student striker. And I'm going to talk, for those of you that don't know about the Moton student strike, That's where this project largely originated, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that here in a moment. But I felt like I had to tell the story of Priya and Elizabeth because it's rooted in student civic action, and very, very powerful student civic action that has a pivotal impact upon the community in which we live. And that's, again, why I teach social studies, why I think social studies is important. And it's related to the exhibit because that in itself is a form of civic action taken by these students who are with us this evening. Let's skip forward from this recognition in February to a few months later. These same two students are now back again in Farmville, and they are there on April 23rd, 2024. That is the anniversary of the Moton student strike. That strike evolves into a court case. That strike was in protest of Jim Crow inequality and unfair and unjust circumstances in public schools. And the students there went on strike in protest of that. It evolves into a court case. That court case then is included a few years later as a part of the landmark case in Brown versus Board of Education. So we are back to the spot, quite literally, where it happened in this photo. They're on the grounds of the Moton Museum, which is the historic Moton School, where that strike originated and happened on April 23rd, 2024. They are making national news in that photograph. That is Steve Osunsami, some of you may recognize from Good Morning America, and they are being interviewed there on the right for about a 5-minute feature on national news about this project. And being at Moton couldn't be more symbolic. From that, Priya and Elizabeth wanted to create a state marker in commemoration of these events and in recognition of them. That's a story unto itself, and I felt like I should tell that story tonight because we've never taken the time to actually discuss all of the steps that it took to place a federal marker, one, about that history, but two, on federal property at a federal courthouse on North Main Street in Harrisonburg. These students collaborated with a number of partners and built a coalition to bring this forward, including Congressman Ben Cline, Senator Tim Kaine, the city of Harrisonburg, town manager Andy Banks, working with Rocktown History here with Miss Imeson, working with the county schools in my office to bring that forward. There were countless partners. But one of our greatest champions was the location where we wanted to place this marker. And those were the judges at the federal courthouse, namely Judge the Honorable Elizabeth Dillon, who was a speaker at our event on May 17th. She counseled us and was a supporter along the way, and just was a very special friend of the project, and it became quite a mentor along the way, helping us navigate some of these circumstances. But wrote letters of support for this effort. But of course, the final approval, she told us and cautioned us, does not rest with the federal judge. we will adjudicate the law, but we don't get to decide this one. The agency known as the General Services Administration, which may be new to some of you, it was new to me as a social studies teacher. I didn't know what the GSA was, but they control, they're a federal agency that oversees all federal properties, including courthouses and their associated properties. And they said no to us on 2 separate occasions. They denied this on a variety of reasons. They were very kind about it. They were not opposed to what we were trying to do, but felt that there was no precedent to justify the placement of a historic marker. So this was kind of uncharted waters to a degree, but we felt that that was the most symbolic place to put the marker. And I would have to say, Andy Banks, the city of Harrisonburg, encouraged us not to give up and said, work with your local legislators. Reach out to Congressman Kline's office as constituents, of course, the 6th district, but also to your United States senators. Senator Kaine in particular, being associated with the history, particularly through his wife's family, the Honorable Ann Holton, who was, of course, daughter of former Governor Linwood Holton, who just happened to be the governor in Virginia, who ended massive resistance during his tenure in Richmond. So they became very good supporters of this project. So here is just a screenshot I grabbed of Senator Kane's chief of staff. That's Mike Henry. On the far right, you can see Pri and Elizabeth. At the bottom, you can see me in my office. And we are making our case, just like we made with Congressman Klein, about the importance of this. So this is true civic action by these students and advocacy, unlike I've ever seen as a social studies teacher. Once we received permission after 2 denials, 2 no's, and continuing on, resilience, I think, on the part of these students in particular to keep working in spite of that, we went before the city council to announce that we had received approval and that the GSA was seeking permission to work with the city of Harrisonburg to oversee the marker, to care for it, to install it, and that GSA would give them permission as a local entity to install that on federal property. There's a lot of details there in red tape that I won't go into, with a lot of letters between Andy Banks and the General Services Administration, but nonetheless, and the federal court to make that happen. But that was the breakthrough right there. And I think that photograph really captures it beautifully, because I'm not leading this effort. I'm the teacher who is facilitating. I'm standing at the side as a guide. This was truly a student-led endeavor where these 2 young ladies prepared this, articulated it, made their arguments, and were heard by city council and by their local representatives. That's democracy. That's democracy in action, and it's a very powerful story of civic action. And 2 years later, May 17th, which also happens to be the 71st anniversary of the Brown decision being announced on those same steps of the Supreme Court that you saw earlier, now here on the steps of a federal court in our hometown, and the implementation of Brown in the state of Virginia. Judge Paul was the first to ever adjudicate and issue a court order demanding the implementation of Brown, despite all of the various delays that were attempted by many Virginia legislators at that time, program that many even know as massive resistance that went on for some time afterwards. So that was part 1. That was the morning. Okay, now we're going to shift to the second part, the second wedding that we carried out that day, the afternoon events that were held here. As you can see, that's in the featured gallery here at Rocktown. We had a luncheon here. This was a packed room. There were a number of folks here that were connected to that story. I think I'll highlight a few of those just as honored guests. We had the executive director of the Moat Museum, Kanan Townsend, who was a partner in this regard of these 2 museums working together. We had Joan Johns Cobbs, who you saw earlier in the photograph, who was the younger sister of the late Barbara Johns. We had a number of folks that were Moton student strikers. And we also had the Yule family. The Yule family was from Prince Edward County. They left Prince Edward because of the school closures during massive resistance, and they came back to Harrisonburg in the late 1950s, early 1960s, because the children needed education, obviously. There were 6 Yule children, but Mr. Yule was an educator himself. So when the schools shut down in Prince Edward during massive resistance, Mr. Yule lost his job. We found out through our research that Mr. Yule was actually, it's just an amazing anecdote I have to share. Mr. Yule was not only a teacher, he was the assistant principal in Prince Edward County in 1959 when the schools closed. And lo and behold, he was assistant principal, vice principal of a little school called Robert Russa Moton High School. So he was the vice principal at the school where the student strike had originated 9 years earlier in 1951. On April 23rd. So that was hard to fathom for us, that is the family that then comes here and is one of the first families to desegregate Rockingham County Public Schools and change the world for us as members of this community, as educators and students. They had a fundamental impact on our lives, a very tangible impact on our lives, obviously. So those are the 2 projects that came together on May 17th. I want to give a little backstory to just set up the students and what they're going to present, because again, this is about taking informed action, and that's related to a special field of social studies where I would say really the social studies field is shifting. This is best practice for social studies. A lot of you are probably taught history in a very rote fashion, and not that facts and dates are unimportant, they are, but sometimes that's where a lot of history instruction stops. And we need to know our facts, we need to know our dates, we need to know the details and the context, but we need to do more with that. It's not just about rote memorization, it's about application and skill development and civic action, and all of these things that we've been talking about are far beyond just a textbook and bold-faced words. So inquiry, I think, captures that pedagogy, that teaching practice best in social studies. Framing curriculum around a compelling question where you don't have a predetermined answer. Standards are great, but standards are basically answers. They aren't questions. Here's the facts you're supposed to teach kids. We do need that. That's important. But we need to ask questions that compel students to really engage in that and think critically about it. And you can't have a predetermined answer, because otherwise you're just memorizing. That truly is indoctrination, by the way. You need to give students the opportunity to wrestle with issues, determine what they think their opinion is, and not just form opinions absent of facts, but be able to make evidentiary-based claims supported by evidence. That is what we need as a democracy and a society to be able to survive and thrive. That's what democracy depends upon. So I'm very much, as a social studies teacher and as a citizen, a proponent of that type of learning, and I think that this demonstrates it rather well. So I've talked a lot about the Moton student strike. There finally is Barbara John. She is the one that led the strike. There's the statue that is on the grounds of the General Assembly building right next to the governor's mansion in Richmond that went up in 2008, the 50th anniversary of the school closures in Prince Edward. I think it should be noted that in Prince Edward, schools closed after massive resistance was carried out throughout Virginia. And the governor closed schools in Warren County, Charlottesville, and Norfolk in response to desegregation, and largely in response to Judge Paul's ruling, and a few others. Prince Edward County in 1959, through its local powers in Board of Supervisors, actually closed down their public school system by defunding it. Refusing to allocate tax dollars, refusing to open schools, pay teachers, turn on lights, buy textbooks, and so forth, effectively shutting down public education from 1959 to 1964. That's the longest in our nation's history. It's a very tragic example of massive resistance and just callousness. 4,000 students went without education for 5 years, and that continues to have impact. The highest illiteracy rate in the Commonwealth of Virginia is in Prince Edward County and the surrounding environs because of those events. So that needs to be recognized, of course. And it's also what brought the Ewell family here, as largely refugees within their own state seeking justice and education and equality. So it's interesting that closed doors and injustice in Prince Edward forces doors open in Rockingham. I think that's a very proud story for us, and was quite an honor. That's why I wanted to recognize that they were here in force at the event on May 17th in purple shirts that said "Breaking Barriers and Building Bridges." We've been doing a project with Farmville for years, and I should recognize that very briefly. This all started 10 years ago as a flipped field trip, and that was the idea of actually Jones Johns Cobb, of all people. She came here to speak at 2 of our high schools, and I had the opportunity to have lunch with her. And I tried my best not to just pepper her with questions for an hour and try to allow her to enjoy her meal. But I'm just sitting there kind of pinching myself thinking, I'm having lunch with this legend and this history maker. So it was hard for me. And she, a very kind and gracious woman, told me many personal stories about her family, her sister, her uncle Vernon, who was very pivotal, minister and civil rights activist at the time. And she said, this is all well and good, but if you really want to learn about this history, you need to bring students to Farmville to see it, walk across the grounds where it happened, where it unfolded, stand in the auditorium at Moton High School where my sister called forth the student strike that is now a museum. She said, that's the only way to really learn about this history. And couldn't agree more. And also that was a very serious charge from someone who was quite significant and somebody who I held in very high regard. So I took that quite seriously. But the idea of a flipped field trip, that was interesting to me. That is something that I had in the back of my head. I tried that once at Antietam Battlefield, where I put students, rather than having students just experience a field trip, which many of you, I'm sure everyone in the online has been on a school field trip before. We like to think that they're innovative practices, but oftentimes they're very traditional. It's just you're not in the classroom as the unique aspect or what we might claim as innovation, but students just go on a tour and listen to someone talk at them, and they're not really engaged all that much. They might see an exhibit or see an artifact that's, powerful and compelling, but really that's largely a passive experience. So we wanted to make this active, and in the spirit of the student strike, the student strike at Moton High School was a student-led endeavor. It was led by young people. Back to that photograph earlier where Pre and Elizabeth were the ones at the podium and I was sitting in the seat. We wanted to replicate that. We wanted students to be the tour guides. We wanted them to do the research. We wanted them to lead this event in the way that the student strikers made history themselves. It wasn't their teachers. It wasn't their parents. And in Brown, let's just go to 1951 there, and then Brown in 54. What's unique about Moton is that Brown was actually 5 cases, one in South Carolina, one in obviously Topeka, Kansas. Everybody knows the title case of Brown v. Board, Topeka, Kansas. There was one in Washington, D.C. to show that even in the nation's capital, this problem persists. And also in Delaware to show that in the north, this was a problem north of the Mason-Dixon line, Topeka, Kansas, west of the Mississippi. And that was going to be 4 cases until this young 16-year-old girl decided to go on strike and get on the phone and ask Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson of the NAACP to come represent them. And they almost didn't. They almost said, this is just a bunch of kids, going on strike. They didn't know if they were organized. They didn't know, what they probably had an adult's view that was somewhat skeptical of young people. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. And they said, when Spotswood Robinson, very famously, when we met them, we learned how dedicated they were, and we just didn't have the heart to say no. And that evolves into, of course, Davis versus Prince Edward County, that goes before the Supreme Court in 54 as Brown v. Board. Of the 5 cases, the point being is that all the other 4, it was parents and grandparents and other adult advocates for these young people that brought these cases forward. Davis versus Prince Edward County was a 16-year-old young lady who said, I have had enough. And she was the one that brought it forward and led this strike. This is a student-led civic action, one of the most profound in our nation's history. And largely, this is history that's been covered up for quite some time. But let's skip forward. I'm getting almost to time here. I wanted to keep it to 7:30. I have about 3 or 4 more minutes. I'm going to hand it over to our students. But the long arc of Brown in Virginia, we start with Brown v. Board, the Moton student strike, then Brown v. Board in 54. 2 years later, that's Judge Paul there, in 56, issues the first ruling to implement Brown in Allen v. Charlottesville. 2 years later, he rules in Kilby versus Warren County, which was just in the fall of 58 before school was about to begin. And that's what prompted the governor at the time, J. Lindsay Almond, to close public schools and use the massive resistance laws that had been passed since 1956, largely in response to Judge Paul and his ruling in Allen v. Charlottesville. Meeting with our local judge, John A. Paul, who is a nephew of Judge John Paul, the federal judge, Judge John Paul Jr., he said and shared an anecdote that I found very compelling, that out here in Audubon, the governor who had articulated and coined the phrase massive resistance and led it, Harry Flood Byrd, had actually traveled out to Audubon to meet with Judge Paul. And he said, I won't venture a guess at what that conversation was about, but I think we can all probably assume. But that was the level of involvement by these forces that wanted to prevent desegregation, prevent integration. There in 59, that's Harry Byrd there on the far right, actually traveling all the way out here to Rockingham County to meet personally with Judge Paul and perhaps try to lean on him. I've always been motivated by this quote. I thought I would share it because I feel like this project captures its essence. This is in reflection of Brown. These are the words of the Honorable Thurgood Marshall. And we borrowed a portion of this quote for the film by Pre and Elizabeth and the others. But he famously said, "The legal system can force open doors. Sometimes it can even knock down walls, but it cannot build bridges. That job, of course, belongs to you and me." So to me, all of these various scenarios, opening doors, knocking down walls, building bridges, is captured by the 10 years of this project. It began with Moton, and that really was forcing open doors. That was what led to Brown. I love that photograph there. That's a Turner Ashby High School student with Joy Capera Speaks and Joan Johns Cobbs pointing themselves out in the famous plaintiff's photograph. Very powerful photograph there. But that's forcing open doors. Then, of course, the film Knocking Down Walls, which is about the court cases to enforce that in Virginia. And that's the Judge Paul Story and the Warren County students and Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson as their attorneys, and bringing that case forward, or those cases forward. That truly was knocking down walls. And then finally, this year, really an emphasis upon building bridges and connecting our two communities, bridging Farmville and its story to Harrisonburg, and how that ripple effect affected every community in this country, but had a unique connection between Farmville and the place that we call home. So we organized that as an inquiry, and the driving question for this inquiry was, how do we write history? And I'm going to spend about a minute or two just kind of unpacking this, and then the students are going to show you how they did that. We chose this question very carefully. We probably spent 3 or 4 days wrestling over what is the exact right question to ask. How do you phrase it? What are you really asking? A good inquiry question is something that as a designer you really wrestle with. And it's always less words. It's always 4 or 5, 6 words maybe. And it's very simplistic seemingly, but there's a lot of depth. And I think this one captures that rather well. So how do we write? Not necessarily right the wrongs of the past. I don't think you can ever really do that, of course. But how do you address injustice? How do you teach about injustice? They don't call it hard history because it's easy to teach. These are things that make us uncomfortable. These are injustices that contradict our values of what we teach ourselves about democracy and what it means to be an American. These are counter to those principles, at least initially. The fight against those injustices could not be more American in their essence, because that is democracy in action, that is civic action, that is citizens standing up for what we believe in and our shared values and our shared history. And that is a very proud, patriotic story, in my opinion, even though it has hard elements to it. Meeting these various plaintiffs taught us that. But there's a nuance there. You have to tell both stories. You have to embrace and confront the injustice, but you also have to celebrate that people were resilient and overcame in spite of. That is the right history, R-I-G-H-T. But it's a play on words, because these students would be writing history, developing it for public view, and that is W-R-I-T-E, of course. So trying to do both. Now that's a lot of words, but if you look at those are 3 columns, okay? So let me just walk you through. I'm not gonna, of course, address every source here, but let's take a look at just column 1. You have a question, task, and source. For each column, you have a question, task, and source. So let's just, in these slides, go through the questions. So in order, the first question we ask students is, what is public history and how is it developed? So just understanding the concept of public history, because that's what they were going to practice as historians and develop an exhibit for. So it started here. Actually, behind the screen is that very artifact, the Stonewall Jackson map, that for years has told a very, very kind of like narrow story of the Civil War. So how do we deal with the Civil War history and how that's been interpreted in certain ways, and the stories that it tells, but also more importantly, the stories that get overlooked with that perspective? It certainly was a military perspective. It definitely had somewhat of a romanticized view of the Confederacy, and it told exclusively the story of Stonewall Jackson as a Confederate general. So how do we broaden that to a larger story? But also more importantly, how do we look at stories that have maybe been overlooked? or perhaps omitted. And this story about Judge Paul was one that did not for years get a lot of attention. So it was really cool for kids to be able to do history and look at something that actually was an opportunity to create and do original research and create an original product. That gave them an opportunity, but also I think looking at the story as to why that perhaps has not been discussed over the years, because it is hard history. It's hard to talk about. And that was supporting question 2. Supporting question 3, then, the culmination of this inquiry experience, how can public history then confront and then counter acts of omission? And that's where civic action comes in, and that's what set the stage for what they did, was to actually do that and confront this omission and perhaps correct it. And within that, you have a writing of history as well as with an R, and a writing of history with a W. I'll share this one anecdote and then I'll hand it off to you all. This is in Moten Auditorium. So the first 2 were visits here. And then supporting question 3 was to go to Moten in Farmville and tie this all together. That's in Moten Auditorium where the student strike happened. And that was a building that was nearly torn down in the late 1990s or mid 1990s. It was saved through various efforts, largely the League of Women Voters, the Martha E. Forrester Council of Women, in Prince Edward County, which is a group of civic-minded, largely African-American women who sought to save this building, purchase it from Prince Edward County, from the local government, and save it. The city government at that time wanted to tear it down because they thought this is an embarrassment. This is a tragic part of our past for a variety of reasons and variety of perspectives, some of them rooted in racism and white supremacy. We have to confront that. Wanted to erase that. And that narrowly was defeated. One source in the inquiry, it's made up of sources, as you can see on the bottom row. We're all about primary sources in social studies. This was a very powerful primary source. This was a news editorial written by the editor of the Farmville Herald, which used to be a bastion of segregation. This is Mr. Ken Woodley, who wrote this against the recommendations of his editor, who said, hey, you got to tone this down. I don't know if this is a little bit incendiary. I mean, you're titling it, "Shall We Tear Down America?" The owner of the newspaper was not a fan of that. And Mr. Woodley chose to publish it anyway. And through this act of defiance, was risking, of course, his job and his career. And he said, this is something that has to be saved, and there's no way to diplomatically save Moten High School. The opening line says, and that's him reading it, by the way, to these students in Moten High School. That was chilling. He came in, had it printed, and read it to us in the building that he helped save. But I'll just borrow a line from it, and then I'm going to pass it over. If we're going to tear down the former R. Moten High School, now Farmville Elementary School, well, let's go ahead and tear down Independence Hall too, and dump the Liberty Bell in the river. Let's use the oldest extant copy of the Declaration of Independence to make a paper airplane and fly it off the Washington Monument, which will also be torn down and replaced with a fast food restaurant. He was very forthright and meant what he said, and it had an impact. And that was civic action in his time, shared it with these students who were taking civic action in their time. And here's a few photographs from that day. Here are the students of the Resilience Amid Resistance exhibition. There's Joan Johns Cobbs once again pointing herself out in the plaintiff's photograph. There's Kanan Townsend, the executive director of the Moten Museum. And I'm going to turn it over now to some students from Turner Ashby High School. We have Nista Jarmarkatel. I said it wrong, didn't I? Jarmarkatel? Nista Jarmarkatel and Campbell Gay, who are going to tell us a little bit about their experiences. And then we have a student, Lauren Cross from Spotswood High School, who will share some of her reflections. So without any other delay, come on up. I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, good afternoon. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nista Jamarkatel, and I'm a rising senior from Turner Ashby High School. Um, Today, I wanted to talk a bit of background behind what really drove us into creating this project. It really started when we took a trip down to the Moton Museum. And it was there that my group members and all of our passions just truly sparked when we started this project down there. Um, it was about a 2-hour drive down, and we had stepped off the bus, and one of the first things I had noticed was this giant mural in the distance. As you can see, it's right there, but like from where I was, it was more of a blob. But I could make out the words, I could see the picture, and I could tell it had writing. But I couldn't quite read it. But I remember what I saw. I saw a girl writing, and beside her were several milestone dates dedicated to the civil rights movement, along with a significant mention of the Moton school strike. Although I hadn't really seen it well in person, I was immediately drawn to it. Something about the entire tone of the project was set right there for me. The mural contained an important quote that I'll get to later, but when we entered the museum and we went through each section, it was just incredibly inspiring. I just remember like my heart racing as we walked through each of the halls, and it just it felt like home to me. And like everything about that museum just made me feel like it made me want to do this even more. Like every single panel, like instead of the information like in usual, like in museums you'll see like information like in a reconstruction, blah blah blah, this happened. Instead of doing that, each panel displayed the information out in quotes from the people who were there. This was special. While like much of the history that we read is written in the words of people who didn't experience it, the history that was written there was experienced, and it was experienced by the people who basically wrote it, the people who had their information displayed out in this museum. And it was just the concrete spread of true human experience, and it just made my heart race. It was a fantastic experience. And we were also learning about Black history in a museum where significant Black history occurred. The museum is where the Moton school strike happened. It was just fantastic. And in that building, students our age had striked for what they thought was right, and they striked for true change. And that in itself is just, we attempt to replicate it, but we can't replicate it. So this project is just, it's just phenomenal in order to secure that history in place. I'd like to end off, this is really quick, I'd like to end off reading a quote dedicated on the mural by Reverend Francis Griffin. He said, quote, "The eyes of the world are on us," end quote. No matter what you're doing, no matter how old you are, or where in life you may be, the eyes of the world will always be watching over you. Thank you all for listening. It's really quick.
So as Nista said, my name is Campbell, and kind of what I'm going to be talking about is the content that was throughout the whole exhibit, but especially throughout ours. So the content of ours was kind of the setup for like what prepared the people at the Moton Museum to put them to this point and the context surrounding that. So we started ours off in Reconstruction and how that started to set up people for these bad school situations that people at the Moton School were in, and how that started to become and the laws that were starting to be developed. We kind of connected that back to Harrisonburg by talking about Lucy F. Sims and the impact she had on education in Harrisonburg throughout the school, and her ability to teach and how she really broke down barriers for people of color in the Harrisonburg and Rockingham area. After that, we started talking about the Effinger Street School and how that was similar to the Moton School due to it being a public school in that area and the positives of it that they created from the poor situation, but also the negatives surrounding it. Then we also talked about the rise of Jim Crow, especially throughout in Rockingham, Virginia. We used a picture of the KKK in Elkton to show on how prevalent they were in this area, but of course also all throughout the South. But the biggest part of our panels was talking about the lost cause that was another reason that the schools developed to this extent, because of course schools were segregated, but after segregation, they were still had issues, of course. So throughout our research for that, we were able to, one of our teachers showed us papers from the time when the schools in our area were being named and how the hate that it was associated due to desegregation came into play there. And we've also seen that, of course, recently, how that's continued. And overall, like, these slides helped set up the context to understand the Barbara John story more and how to understand how that still affects us today. And I'll hand it off to Lauren.
Good evening, everyone. I'm a rising senior at Spotswood High School. I'm going to kind of give you an overview of the graphic design process. So we wanted to play on the Rocktown History logo, and that got turned into this color palette right there. We also use those arrows throughout our thing. We kind of had like a big rule book almost to go by. We had a bunch of guidelines, what to do, what font to use, what size of font, because everything has to be cohesive. Obviously, we wanted to have like creative freedom, but it also has to look like everything goes together. It has to look like we actually have a museum exhibit. So I have a picture of all the font that we use at the bottom there. And we had a lot of inspiration for our museum panels. Like, obviously, we visited here. We saw what worked here at the Rocktown History Museum. At Moton, we also saw like what they did, what they chose to do there. And then another big inspiration for me was also the Lucy Sims exhibits that are displayed in all of our local high schools. So I'm going to go through a quick rundown of what it looked like to design my panel specifically. So this was sort of my first draft, kind of what it looked like. Originally, mine was focusing on Harry F. Byrd. And I remember I sat down one day in study hall. I was in the library and I was like, what should I do? Where do I start? Because for me, one thing is writing. I feel like I could draft a pretty good cohesive summary of what I should say, but how do I display that and how do I make that memorable for the audience? So this is my first draft. I remember walking down to where the Lucy Sims panels were displayed in Spotswood and looking at how everything was displayed and getting some inspiration there. And then shortly I turned this into our teachers and it turned into this. I added an underline up there. And then I made the text box at the top bigger and I deleted the arrow and then I made it bigger again. And then eventually morphed into this. And then I added the things at the bottom and this is my finished design. So as you can see, it took quite a bit of editing to get to where it finally was. And I think that just really explains how much time and effort it actually took to make all of our panels to the final draft. And then here is the first 3 slides of the Spotswood group. So beyond just making our own panels, we had to make sure everything was cohesive and everything went together. As you could see, we only had those 4 color panels to work with at the beginning. We had to make everything sort of flow together. So as you can see, we have some consistencies with the use of the white spaces, and then we didn't lap the colors back to back. We all used that underline, and we all just tried to make everything as cohesive as possible while we still had that creative freedom. So I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Dickenson.
Thank you so much. You guys did great. Wonderful job. Thank you, ladies. Again, the spirit of this project. Here's one of the Moton student strikers who just, I hate to say this, passed away this past January. Very good friend of our project. His name was the Reverend J. Samuel Williams. And this is him speaking to students in Moton Auditorium during one of our previous field trips. It was the last time we saw Reverend Williams. And the essence of his comment spoke to that no one's ever going to ask you what your opinion is. You need to have the confidence to tell them and to be able to take action and put yourself out there. No one's going to tell you what to do or what to think. Some might try, and he names a few people in the video, but it was a very profound moment. And him being a student striker himself when he was a teenager, talking about civic action and talking about how young people can leave a mark on the world. That, to me, is what this project has always been about. And we had never envisioned anything like the marker coming out of this project or a student curated exhibition of 20 plus panels. And I feel the need to recognize a few folks. So Rocktown History, of course, partnering with the Moten Museum, both of those institutions giving us incredible access and support along the way. The Rockingham Educational Foundation supporting this particular year of the Moten, what we call the Farmville Tour Guides Project that evolved into these two endeavors. Excuse me, we do have her permission. I want to make sure we could. Karen Yule of the Yule family made a very generous donation to this project, along with the Gwynn Family Foundation through the Community Foundation of the Central Blue Ridge. So we really formed a community of sponsors and supporters and volunteers to make something like this student action possible and to be printed and produced for public view, for all of you to come and see here in the featured gallery at Rocktown History. And it'll be here, Miss Imeson, until how long do they have? Projecting late September. And the one exciting part of this is that the day that we unveiled it, a number of other partners had expressed interest in having it go on tour. So a number of our students, these three in particular, are here in June giving up their summer breaks because they are going to continue on in an internship opportunity that'll be Farmville year 11, or I guess 12 now. It'll be the final year and capstone of this project, but they are going to take this project, this exhibit, on tour to a variety of museums and institutions around the Commonwealth of Virginia. They'll present about it. We just found out yesterday we were accepted to present at the National Council of Social Studies in Washington, D.C. in December about this with Dr. Kathy Swan from the University of Kentucky, who helped write that inquiry question. And a lot of you in the audience might not know, but Kathy Swan is like the #1 person in the field of social studies ed in the country. So we're kind of a big deal, guys. I'm going to leave it on that note. Thank you, Ms. Imeson, for giving us the opportunity to share this. Thank you all in the audience, and we wish you a good evening.
This was just spectacular if we're talking about kicking off civic season. And you couldn't have done a better job of explaining and underlining and letting everybody know the importance of civics, and history is fundamental to that. So thank you. Thank you, students. Certainly appreciate you spending some time with us. And I want to put a plug in for the Rocktown History donors who gave over the years towards these two endeavors, the documentary and the exhibition. And if you would like to see more of these kinds of programs, we're trying to keep most everything free. We'd love your support this evening and any other time that we ask. But if you're watching this evening, please consider a donation at rocktownhistory.org. And thank you so much for joining us.